I'm joined now by Emily Zanotti. She's a great friend of the Stephen Harriott Show, and she's the senior editor at the Daily Wire. And she has some interesting things to say this week because she, I think, am I right, Emily, has had it with censorship and with burning books. Is that far off?
I think I've reached my limit this week, honestly.
Well, what we're talking about is the latest book burning has been centered around the Little House on the Prairie books. A lot of people were raised on those. Actually, I've always known that they're pretty politically incorrect. When we were kids, my mother read it to us, and we all used to kind of chortle over how politically incorrect particularly Ma was. And I remember distinctly the line that Ma utters, which is that the only good Indian is a dead Indian. She's pretty bitter about the Native Americans around her. So what do you think? Do you think we should be censoring this kind of stuff? Do you want to throw these books out because of that kind of stuff? What do you think?
I think most people are intelligent enough to understand the context in which they were written. I mean, it's not shocking to believe that someone who existed in the 1800s or who was writing about her childhood in the 1800s as a pioneer under threat of Native Americans would have these kind of opinions. I mean, they're politically incorrect and you recognize them as such, but we still read great works of literature, even if they happen to be a little bit politically incorrect. I mean, Shakespeare's politically incorrect. Mark Twain's politically incorrect. At this point, based on today's standards, anything written prior to 2013 is probably considered politically correct, especially if you identify someone as a woman or a man. So it's kind of strange that all of a sudden everyone's like, Laura Ingalls Wilder is the worst.
Right. Well, it's funny. Actually, I do think that if basically the average leftist in the year 2015 forgot to check his email or look online for a few years, by now, just 3 years later, they would be considered a white supremacist by their own fellow leftists. It's amazing how quick.
I mean, we have every leftist in the world has, of course, used the Harry Potter novels as a way of defining their resistance against Donald Trump. And I think if you look even back at those, the early novels have been sort of rewritten by their author to encompass more gender inclusivity and racial inclusivity, but those novels are themselves not even politically correct by today's standards, and they were written, I think I was in high school, late middle school, so it's kind of strange. But of course we have this American Society of Children's Librarians who had their meetup this weekend in New Orleans and decided to rename their Laura Ingalls Wilder Lifetime Achievement Award to just the American Society for Children's Librarians Lifetime Achievement Award, because Laura Ingalls Wilder was no longer in working with the organization's dedication to diversity and inclusion and gender inclusivity and racial inclusivity. It's pretty fascinating.
You cut out a little bit there while you were talking about the jargon of leftism and sexual progressivism, and I think it was because maybe an intercession on the part of an angel to protect our audience from hearing that nonsense. But I get the big picture. You know what's really, though, as funny as it is sometimes to see these people wringing their hands over this stuff, I think it's actually very dangerous and insidious because, like you mentioned, the Harry Potter author, she's actually willingly adjusting her own earlier work, right, to match ideology. She's one of the rare exceptions. Most authors would not consent to such a thing. And in general, the rapidity with which we are discarding ideas and so forth. Here's the thing. I think what happens is, especially very powerful and influential and highly educated leftists, they get together and they look at literature and they look at cultural artifacts and they consider them in a complete vacuum and say, do we approve of these? And that's all. The answer to that little discussion, that small, insular committee, they think of the answers that they come up with as totally appropriate for an entire nation, in fact, the whole world. And when they impose that on people, it's an inevitable culture war that they're starting. And because people aren't ready to accept their claims, and they would probably, in other words, these discussions don't include ordinary consumers of literature. So people get crushed.
Ordinary intellectuals. Now, this is another matter, is that these discussions often include people who are intellectuals in gender studies, who are intellectuals in in a sort of cultural anthropology. They're not really intellectuals in the field of study of, say, English literature. And so what happens is, like, say last week we had a lot of comparisons to Nazi Germany in terms of the immigration debate. We had a lot of comparisons to Hitler. And I happened to be writing a book on World War II and was sort of like, guys, you need to take a step back. We need to examine this more fully. It's one of the most cataloged events in recent human history. And the connections just aren't there, or you're misunderstanding them. And these are perfectly intelligent leftists who just don't happen to believe that that particular interpretation, the interpretation that history agrees on, is correct. So it happens across all sorts of boundaries. And this is becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. And where leftists aren't able to influence this sort of historical analysis, they're essentially erasing it. So if you go to schools now, no longer do we study American government, no longer do we study the Second World War, no longer do we study a lot of these things outside of the context of gender studies, outside of the context of our current belief system. And teachers are interpreting these historical events to match their political ideology. So you have a situation where kids are growing up not getting good education and not reading good books because essentially they've been reinterpreted completely in the lens of 2018.
Yeah. And you know what really worries me a little bit is, first of all, with the Ingalls Wilder thing, what we're talking about is children's literature. Right? So with a lot of this mainstream discourse, it's very mature stuff. It's between adults, and it really is the stuff out of which election results come, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm okay with a kind of free-for-all there, and it can get pretty gritty. But when you're sneaking in and changing what our children are raised on, then I get a little worried that, wait a minute, they were exposed. If I sent my child, which I never would, to a public school, I would no longer have anything in common culturally with that child once they were through with him, because he would never have exposure to Ma, who says that the only good Indian is a dead Indian. I by the way, I never liked her for saying that. We were raised kind of saying, isn't it funny how bitter she is, you know? Right. But she had lost family members in massacres. And
that's kind of, you have to understand it in the context of the pioneer experience, right? And that's something that children will not be given the opportunity to understand. So these people were essentially pushed out of the East Coast, pushed out to Kansas, pushed out to Missouri, onto Indian territory, and we didn't care. We just told them to kill the Indians and get on with it. And that created conflict. And we don't learn things in that context any longer. Now we're just like, oh, well, what she said is bad. Yeah, it's bad, but why is it bad?
Well, and the other thing is, here's one last point. I've got to make this point because, like, one of Bernie Sanders' staffers today called Gavin McInnes a neo-Nazi. So this is a person who has actually worked for what might have been the next president of the United States. So this is very mainstream. Calling a person a neo-Nazi, I think, without grounds for saying so. And one effect of this is that you end up saying things like Ma from the Little House on the Prairie is one way or the other unspeakably evil. Right. So you don't even hear from her. And what I'm worried about is kids are going to start meeting people like Gavin McInnes and say, oh, so this is what a Nazi is. And we're going to raise a whole generation of kids who think Nazi is a synonym for avuncular. Or, you know, it's like, oh, Nazis apparently are guys who sit around and drink buds and tell funny stories.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Is like, your dad is a Nazi. It's one of those things where you also really, you distance people from the real horror that was committed by Nazi Germany, right? So Gavin McInnes isn't going out there and saying we should round up 10 million people and exterminate them en masse. That's what happened. And the concentration camp experience is harrowing. And every time you use this title to call someone who clearly isn't a Nazi, who isn't supportive of that kind of horrifying behavior, a Nazi, you're diminishing the impact of what Nazism actually perpetrated on Earth. And it has an impact both, oh, everyone's a Nazi, but it also says, you know, the people who survived concentration camps really didn't survive all that much, or I don't think Nazis are all that bad because my dad happened to have been called a Nazi. That it doesn't do anybody any favors to make these comparisons.
Right. And on a final note, The Little House on the Prairie is not Mein Kampf.
No.
and we should be able to read it, I think. But anyway.
Or
yes.
at least watch the adorable 70s television show. I mean, I didn't really like the books, but I did like the television show.
Well, I can't watch it because it's overwhelmingly white.
Are you microaggressed?
I am microaggressed, yes. No, thank you very much, Emily, for this analysis. I can't wait to have you on again soon. And I'm going to go out and buy a couple of copies of this series before they're burned.
Yeah, no, definitely go out and get a couple copies. They'll be collector's items when they finally Fahrenheit 451 everyone. But that's also a book that nobody reads anymore, so okay.
That's right. All right. Well, God bless. Talk to you soon.
Talk to you soon.